You know Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen, Comet and Cupid and Donner and Blitzen, but do you recall the most famous reindeer of all? Rudolph, of course. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, the most famous reindeer of all. And yet, have you read 'Twas the Night Before Christmas? Of course you have. It's actually called A Visit from St. Nicholas, but we all call it The Night Before Christmas. It's one of those. Published anonymously in a newspaper in 1823, but later credited to an American writer and scholar named Clement Clark Moore, it reads, and I quote, "When what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all." Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, Blitzen. No Rudolph. Where's Rudolph? Well, you may be surprised to learn that the most famous reindeer of all would not appear for another 116 years. And when he did, he took the world by storm, becoming one of the most beloved Christmas characters of all time. But did you know that Rudolph was not the genius idea of some big business tycoon like Mattel or Disney? No, Rudolph was the genius idea of a regular old guy, a department store copywriter, struggling to support his family, an underdog determined to live out the same fate as his beloved reindeer character. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. After getting sucked into the abyss of the French Revolution for a few weeks, I was determined to swing things more in a light and inspirational direction for you leading up to the holidays. I hope you found last week's episode about the Wright brothers' first flight as inspirational as I did. That one really surprised me and just became more and more meaningful and special as it developed. Like, it just took its own shape. I couldn't have anticipated the way that one came out, and I love it so much. And honestly, this story is thematically kind of similar. These are underdog stories where regular, normal, underrated people rise up, quite literally in the case of the Wright brothers, seemingly out of nowhere to create something significant. And actually, now that I say that, the French Revolution also follows that theme in a little bit less inspirational way. I think this type of story resonates with everyone, at least a little bit. This one in particular, the one I'm going to tell you today, really speaks to me for reasons that I'll get into later. This episode idea, by the way, came from my dear friend Ryan, who shared an Instagram reel with me by Alex at Pop Culture Brain. I was planning to cover a totally different Christmas-related topic this week, one I wasn't very excited about. So thank you, Ryan. Your timing was perfection. And I think you guys are going to love this story. Let's go back to the early 1900s, around 100 years ago. There was no Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer yet. There weren't very many big Christmas characters at all. There was no Grinch. There was no Frosty the Snowman. Certainly no Kevin McAllister or Buddy the Elf. There was Santa Claus, of course. There was Ebenezer Scrooge as well. Clement Clark Moore's A Visit from St. Nicholas, aka The Night Before Christmas, pretty much put Santa Claus and his flying reindeer on the map back in the 1820s. And then came Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol in 1843, and that was kind of it. Those were the two big Christmas pop culture literary anythings. Until 1939, when a department store copywriter named Robert L. May came up with the idea for Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Robert was born on Long Island, New York in 1905. He was Jewish, like ethnically, but not religiously. His family was not religious, so they were what we would call secular Jews. His family owned a lumber company called May Lumber Co., and they were relatively wealthy. Robert had a brother and two sisters, and fun fact, one of his sisters, Evelyn May, was the grandmother of economist Stephen D. Levitt, who would go on to write the wildly popular book Freakonomics. His other sister, Margaret, would go on to marry songwriter Johnny Marks, who would become quite successful, especially when it comes to hit Christmas songs, and we'll come back to that. But I just find that very interesting. So much talent and success in this one family. But at the time when Robert was growing up, no, there was none of that yet. They were just a Jewish family from Long Island that owned a lumber company. And actually, Robert was a rather shy, small, nerdy kid. According to an NPR interview between David Green and Robert's daughter, Barbara May Lewis, quote, Robert was a bit of an outcast, just like Rudolph. He skipped a grade or two and so was younger and smaller than his classmates. He was a nerdy kid who saw himself as a loser, end quote. Robert himself would later say that he, quote, had known what it was like to be an underdog, end quote. And so as he graduated high school and headed off to Dartmouth College, he was not the most confident fellow. And you may be thinking, skipped a few grades, Dartmouth College, this guy seems destined for success, nerdiness aside. But Robert was by no means an instant success. Despite dreams of one day writing the next great American novel, Robert graduated from Dartmouth in 1926 and went to work as a copywriter for R.H. Macy & Co. department store in New York City. You know this business as Macy's department store, which is what it's called now, like of Thanksgiving parade fame. So Robert gets hired as a copywriter for Macy's. A copywriter, at that time at least, wrote the words for catalogs. Basically, he wrote ads for Macy's catalogs. So he was a writer to some extent, but certainly not the type of writer he had hoped to be. He left that job after only a year and moved around a bit, working as an advertising manager for J.L. Brandis & Co. department store in Omaha, Nebraska, and Rich's department store in Atlanta, Georgia. This was like the era of department stores. They were like a big deal at this point. During those years, he got married to Evelyn Ruth Heyman, who was also from New York, like him. And in 1930, they moved back to New York, and Robert got a job as an assistant sales manager at Butterick Company. So he's basically Dwight Schrute, but not at a paper company, at a publishing company. Butterick published sewing patterns. Okay, so copywriting, publishing, we're dancing around a writing career, sort of, here. But unfortunately, 1930s, not a good time to be in any sort of career because the Great Depression hits and Robert loses his job at Butterick in 1932. And he can't even fall back on old Ma and Pa. The absolutely abysmal economy means that they are also forced to close down their lumber company and they lose most of their wealth. Jobs are few and far between at this point, and Robert spends a year unemployed and desperately seeking work. In 1933, he is finally hired as a copywriter at Gimbel Brothers department store in New York City. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that is where Will Ferrell's character, Buddy the Elf, works in the movie Elf, at Gimbel's. Gimbel's was a real department store that operated for 145 years. It was actually Macy's biggest rival. They were like dueling department stores. According to the American Business History Center, Gimbel Brothers was the largest and most profitable department store retailer in America. But Macy's would ultimately come out on top, and Gimbel's officially closed its doors in 1987. Now, when making the movie Elf back in 2003, they actually wanted to film the department store scenes at Macy's and use their store name, Macy's, but Macy's wasn't having it. They refused to have their name or location used in the movie, which I think was kind of dumb. Seems like a missed opportunity to me for some very powerful publicity, but whatever. So the filmmakers went with Gimbel's instead, which was, of course, a now out-of-business old competitor, arch rival of Macy's. They were actually able to license the Gimbel's name for the film. And I feel like that was this sort of sly, underhanded, like, screw you guys to Macy's after they wouldn't let them use their name. I'm like, y'all blew it, Macy's. Anyways, we're way off topic. Robert gets a job at Gimbel Department Store, writing catalog ads, copywriting again. Robert and Evelyn have a daughter together, Barbara, during this time. And then in 1936, he resigns from Gimbel's and moves his family to Chicago. And I'm not entirely sure why, but he must have really wanted to be in Chicago because he takes a job as a copywriter at Montgomery Ward department store that pays significantly less than his old job at Gimbel's. And although this isn't in any of my sources anywhere, I kind of have a hunch that they moved to Chicago for his wife, Evelyn's health, possibly. Maybe there was a doctor or a specialist there or something that they needed to be near. Because at some point around here, Evelyn starts suffering from what Robert called a, quote, long illness. NPR's Morning Edition with Jessica Pupovac says she has cancer, but I don't know what type of cancer or anything. But it's not good. She's not doing well. And of course, they have a toddler, little Barbara. And let me tell you from experience that chronic and debilitating illnesses with toddlers are not fun. That's not an easy situation. But then again, according to Wikipedia, quote, throughout these years, Evelyn worked full-time as a social worker while also studying at Columbia University's New York School of Social Work and teaching part-time at Northwestern University, end quote. So maybe they actually moved to Chicago for Evelyn's job. I don't know. I also don't know how she's doing all of that. How do you work full-time as a social worker, have terminal cancer, attend school in New York, and also teach at a school in Chicago? I don't know. Whatever the reason is, they move to Chicago, and Robert takes this new, lower-paying job. They are getting absolutely buried in medical bills, though, trying to treat Evelyn's cancer. He is in debt at this point. He would later write, quote, I was heavily in debt at age 35, still grinding out catalog copy. Instead of writing the great American novel, as I'd always hoped, I was describing men's white shirts, end quote. And it was around this time, early 1939, January 1939, that his boss at Montgomery Ward approached him with an interesting proposal. Every year at Christmas time, Montgomery Ward gave out coloring books to kids. It was a gimmicky, incentive-y whatever for customers, right? They purchased coloring books in mass from coloring book publishers, and they gave them out to their customers. But this year, they wanted to do something different. Instead of buying coloring books to give out, they wanted to save a little money and write their own children's book. They were going to create their own book to give away to kids this next Christmas. According to Pupovac, quote, May was a hit at holiday parties for his way with limericks and parodies, end quote. And so he was the natural choice as the author of this children's book that they wanted written. They were like, Robert's always saying silly little sing-songy things. Let's get him to write the book. Robert's boss requested a, quote, animal story with a character like Ferdinand the Bull. Disney had just released a short film of Ferdinand, so it was trending at the time. Also, I love Ferdinand. What an incredible, timeless classic. We read it all the time with our boys. If you're not familiar, Ferdinand is a bull who likes to sit in the grass under a tree and smell the flowers while all the other young bulls are snorting and stomping and ramming each other with their horns. And everyone thinks Ferdinand is so weird. What is he doing? He's just sitting there and smelling the flowers. Why isn't he doing the things that bulls do? Why isn't he ramming his horns into us? And when some men come from Madrid to pick a bull for the bullfights, they see all these bulls snorting and stomping and ramming and showing off, trying to get picked, and they're trying to pick the best one, the most ferocious, impressive bull. And Ferdinand is like, well, they're not going to pick me. And so he goes off to sit under his tree. But when he does, he sits on a bee. And it stings him, and he jumps up and he starts snorting and stomping and ramming into the tree and going all crazy because he got stung by this bee. And the men from Madrid see him, and they're like, that one. We want that one. And they load him up in a cart and take him to the bullfights in Madrid, where presumably, although Ferdinand certainly doesn't know this, but presumably he's going to die, right? That's what happens at bullfights. They torture an innocent bull, and they ultimately kill it. Ferdinand gets to the center of the ring, and the matadors are ready to start the bullfight. They have their red flags they're waving around, and they're flashing their swords and spears and pokers. But Ferdinand just plops down in the ring, and starts to smell the flowers on all the ladies' hats in the audience. He won't move. He won't fight. They can't rouse him, and so they just take him home. And he goes back to his tree, and he sits down, and he continues doing his thing. And it's such a beautiful story of being true to yourself, even when others think you are weird, that it's okay to be different. It's good to be different. So that's what they were going for with this children's book. Robert's boss was like, think Ferdinand, but make it Christmas. Now, this brief must have resonated with Robert as well. He was a bit of a Ferdinand himself in his youth, underrated and misunderstood by his peers. During his time at Dartmouth, Robert majored in psychology. He had studied the work of Austrian psychotherapist Alfred Adler, who proposed that the basic human motivation for all things is striving for perfection, and that this comes from a need to overcome feelings of inferiority. And we see this in Robert's own life, this need to overcome feelings of inferiority. He was the smallest, the youngest, the nerdiest kid growing up. Now, as an adult, he was describing men's white shirts in department store catalogs instead of writing the great American novel. He also claimed to have been inspired by the story The Ugly Duckling, which he said always appealed to him as a child. He'd always felt like the ugly duckling, just waiting to someday grow into a swan. But make it Christmas, right? That was the brief. So Robert decided on a reindeer. He wanted to use alliteration with the name, so it needed to start with an R, like reindeer, and he came up with a list of names. And this handwritten list is actually at Dartmouth College. It's pretty cool to see. But some of the names on the list that he came up with: Rollo, Rodney, Roland, Roderick, Reginald. And later in a 1963 interview, he said that Rollo sounded, quote, too happy for a reindeer with an unhappy problem. And Reginald, quote, seemed too sophisticated. But Rudolph, quote, rolled off the tongue nicely. And so Rudolph the reindeer came into being. But what about the red nose part? Well, Robert's in Chicago now, remember, and as the story goes, one winter day, as he was sitting in his Chicago office, he's staring out the window, watching the fog roll in from Lake Michigan, and he starts to think about Santa and how hard that would be to steer a sleigh to deliver all those presents on a foggy night like this. And then he has a light bulb moment, a nose bulb moment. What if Rudolph's nose could light up like headlights so that Santa could see to steer the sleigh through the fog? And what if that light was red for no other reason than the alliteration? I'm pretty sure. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. It can't be like Rudolph the green-nosed reindeer. That's silly. And he goes to his boss and he's like, I've got it. He's a reindeer. His name is Rudolph, and he's smaller than all the other reindeer, so they all make fun of him, but he has this red nose, you see. And they're like, nope, no red nose, no way. Because at that time, a red nose was closely associated with alcoholism and like drunk people. So to them, it's totally inappropriate. I don't really know why. I don't feel like drunk people have red noses, but that was the association at the time. So they shut down the red nose idea. But Robert doesn't give up on it. He gets his coworker, Denver Gillen, who worked at Montgomery Ward as an artist. He drew catalog illustrations and whatnot. He gets this Gillen guy to go with him and his daughter Barbara, who is 4 years old now, to Chicago's Lincoln Park Zoo, where they have deer. I don't think they were actual reindeer. I think they were just regular deer. And Robert gets Gillen to draw Rudolph based on these deer at the zoo. And if you look at Rudolph, I never noticed this, you guys, but if you look at illustrations of Rudolph, he does not look like a reindeer. He looks like a deer. But whatever, Gillen draws Rudolph, pops a red nose on him, and Robert takes the sketch back to management for approval. And despite shutting down the red nose idea at first, this sketch is so cute and innocent and harmless and clearly not an alcoholic deer that they okay the red nose idea after all. So he has his character, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, and he has his story premise. This underdog reindeer that all the other reindeer make fun of gets to prove his real worth by saving Christmas, right? Guiding Santa's sleigh through the fog with his glowing red nose. He starts to write the book, which takes him around 50 hours. It's actually more of a poem. He decides to write it in the same style as The Night Before Christmas, which is anapestic tetrameter, in case you were ever wondering that. So The Night Before Christmas goes, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there." You can kind of hear the rhythm that it has. Here's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. "'Twas the day before Christmas, and all through the hills the reindeer were playing, enjoying the spills of skating and coasting and climbing the willows, and hopscotch and leapfrog protected by pillows." And if you just heard that and realized that you've never actually read Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, then welcome to the club, because that was the same realization I had. I know the song. I've seen the 1964 stop-motion film. I've read the 1972 Little Golden Book version, illustrated by Richard Scarry. I have not read the OG 1939 Robert L. May Rudolph until now. Come to find out. I'm going to link... NPR has the full original manuscript for Rudolph, like handwritten pages that Robert wrote with illustrations. It's really cool. I'm going to link that. You can also listen to his daughter, Barbara May Lewis, read it aloud on that same page. She introduces herself as Rudolph's big sister, which I think I love. So I'm definitely linking that in the description. If you've never read the OG Rudolph like me, read it, listen to it, you gotta. So Robert puts in 50 hours writing this poem for this children's book. And remember, it's just like they're just giving this thing away for free at Christmas. This isn't like some prestigious opportunity. He's not writing The Cat in the Hat Comes Back here. He's just like kind of doing extra work for his already underpaid job. But it becomes something more than that. He finds passion in it. In July of 1939, Robert's wife, Evelyn, dies after a long battle with cancer. Her parents had moved in with them to help out toward the end. And when she dies in July, his boss at Montgomery Ward offers to give the book project to someone else, take a little off his plate. But Robert refuses. He's going to see this thing through. He later wrote, quote, "I needed Rudolph now more than ever." And so he keeps writing, finishing the book in late August. Speaking of this moment, Robert said, quote, "I called Barbara and her grandparents into the living room and read it to them. In their eyes, I could see that the story accomplished what I had hoped." End quote. But remember, it's still just a gimmicky, free book giveaway thing for a department store. And so he hands the manuscript over, and they publish it in time for Christmas 1939. They handed out some 2.4 million paperback copies of the original Rudolph book, and customers loved it. It was very clearly a hit from the beginning. After that, World War II leads to restrictions on paper use, and so they don't reprint and rehand out Rudolph again until after the war in 1946. That year, Montgomery Ward gave away 3.6 million copies to shoppers. But earlier that same year, 1946, Robert received an offer from RCA Victor, which is a record label. They want him to record a spoken word version of Rudolph. And, they're going to pay him and stuff. They want to give him a Rudolph record deal, basically. And at this point, remember, Robert is still very much in debt. He's still buried in his late wife's medical bills. He didn't get paid extra for Rudolph. It was just a project at work. He continued to collect his measly salary. He wasn't getting royalties or anything, so he could really use this money. The problem was he didn't actually own the rights to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Montgomery Ward held the rights. He wrote it as a part of his job for them, so it's actually theirs. And I understand this. I know all about this because of my own job, which started as creating lesson materials for my own students when I was teaching, and then later transformed into a business where I sell those materials to other teachers. Technically, anything that I created for use in my own classroom while I was employed as a teacher belongs to the school district. I technically have no rights to it. So that's how that works. I'm no longer employed by a school district, and so I'm now free to create and sell whatever the heck I want. But that is how it works. But kind of amazingly, in Robert's case, the Montgomery Ward president, Sewell Avery, decided to give Robert full rights to Rudolph. Like, no strings attached. They just gave it to him. Well, okay, one string attached. She had to wait until January 1st, 1947, so that they could give the book away again that 1946 Christmas. But how awesome is that? I mean, it's possible they overlooked the potential, ironically, because that's like the whole message of Rudolph. But I like to think they just did the right thing. You know, this young, down on his luck, in debt, tragically lost his wife, father. I'd like to think they gave it to him because it was just the right thing to do. So as of January 1947, Robert owns the rights to Rudolph. And then, I guess, other people overlooked the potential as well because he has a hard time finding a publishing company that will publish the book commercially. Robert said, quote, "Nobody wanted him, not with 6 million copies already distributed. Finally, I found a publisher, a little guy with a big nose, who said he knew what it was like for Rudolph and he was willing to take a chance on printing," end quote. And that little guy with the big nose was Harry Elbaum, who was the head of Maxton Publishers in New York. He printed 100,000 copies of the book in time for Christmas 1947, and they sold for 50 cents a pop, and it was a huge success. That RCA Victor spoken word recording of the poem was also successful, and that year stuffed Rudolph toys, a puzzle, and children's Rudolph bedroom slippers were also sold. But Rudolph didn't really fully take off until the song. Remember I said that Robert's sister Margaret was married to a songwriter, Johnny Marks? Well, in 1948, Robert persuaded Johnny to write a song to go along with the Rudolph story. Johnny wasn't super successful at this point. He was more of an aspiring songwriter, but he agreed and he wrote the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer that we all know. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer had a very shiny, you know it. He wrote that song. And then they tried to get a big name to sing it. Bing Crosby turned it down. Dinah Shore turned it down. Finally, Gene Autry agreed to record it in 1949 at the insistence of his wife, and it was a smash hit. Gene Autry's original recording of it is the one we all know and love, but it was covered by many different musical artists after that. Mitch Miller, Dean Martin, Perry Como, and even Bing Crosby, that he regretted turning that one down. To this day, it is the second most popular Christmas song of all time, second only to White Christmas, sung by Bing Crosby. Dude could have had both of the top two Christmas songs if he hadn't underrated Rudolph like all the other reindeer. Such a reindeer move, Bing. Rudolph, the song, really launches Johnny's songwriting career, and he would go on to write quite a few other well-known Christmas songs, including Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, A Holly Jolly Christmas, Silver and Gold, and I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. Dude can write a Christmas song. He also composed the score for the 1964 stop-motion animation film of Rudolph, like The Island of Misfit Toys, all those songs. He wrote those as well. So Rudolph really took off. During the 1950s, Robert licensed and sold over 100 different Rudolph-inspired products. And it became such a big operation that he resigned from his job at Montgomery Ward in 1951 and started Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer Enterprises. But by the late 50s, his initial success starts to fizzle some. Apparently, and I'm honestly blown away by this, but apparently at that time, 1950s, the top federal income tax rate was 91 or 92% for individuals and 72% for corporations. Which, I'm sorry, what? But this cuts into Robert's profits so considerably that just 7 years after starting his Rudolph company, he is forced to return to his old department store job. According to an April 1977 edition of Dartmouth Alumni Magazine, Robert returned to his copywriting job at Montgomery Ward. Quote, reminding them of company policy, Wards will take anything back, end quote. So at least the man still got some humor. He's still cracking jokes. He's been through a lot. I'm glad he's still finding some humor. And Robert would continue to work as a copywriter at Montgomery Ward until he retired in 1970. So despite the success of the Rudolph character and the way that it infiltrated Christmas so fully, it didn't exactly make Robert rich. I mean, he was still working his old job until he retired. He did make enough money from it to get out of debt, though, to live comfortably and to provide for his children after he died in 1976. Because he had remarried after Evelyn's death and had 5 more children with his second wife. So he's able to leave them the rights to Rudolph and any royalties that come from that. But he didn't become like Dr. Seuss, right? He's no Eric Carle, no Maurice Sendak. You probably hadn't heard of him before you listened to this episode. Robert L. May remained relatively unknown. But Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, now that's another story. The Gene Autry song, number 2 Christmas song of all time. The 1964 film is the longest-running television special in American history. According to a Hollywood Reporter article by Mia Galuppo, it was chosen as the, quote, most beloved holiday film by a whopping 83% of respondents to a recent survey. Rudolph is a big deal. He's Santa's sidekick. And just like the song promised, he did in fact go down in history. Something about this story really resonates with me. Maybe it's the creating something as a part of your duties for a job and then being able to transform that into something more, into its own business. Robert and I have that in common, I guess. An unexpected opportunity, a chance to pivot to something that you can be proud of, something you feel passionate about. I think about Robert in July of 1939. He's in the thick of it, right in the middle of his work writing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and his wife loses her cancer battle. His wife dies. He loses Evelyn, the mother of his young child, and his boss offers to pass the project on to someone else. But he says no. He's determined to finish it. He says, quote, I needed Rudolph now more than ever. And I feel that so deeply. That's how I feel about History Fix. I need History Fix in the same way that Robert needed Rudolph. It makes no sense. It makes no sense on paper. I shouldn't be doing this. It's insane that I pull this off every week, you guys, with everything else that I have on my plate. It's really crazy. But I need it. I need to do it. It distracts me from the harshness of reality at times. It gives me purpose. Direction. You guys do, really, all of you listening right now. I have you to thank for History Fix. Without you, there would be no point to any of this. So thank you for listening in each week, for giving me purpose. Listening alone is huge. But if you ever feel compelled to support the show further, leaving a 5-star rating and subscribing on whatever podcast app you use is a super easy and free way to do that. Telling people about the show, tell your friends, tell your family, spread the word, also free, also huge. If you want some not free options, they're always linked in the description, ways to donate. Join the Patreon, that's beyond huge. If you subscribe to my Patreon, please know that I bow down in gratitude to you. Every time I get a new Patreon subscriber, I literally jump for joy, you guys. I literally do. I know all of your names, and I am so incredibly grateful for each of you because you are helping to make History Fix sustainable, and that is such a big deal. Also, one last thing. I don't know how this turned into like a shameless plug, but I have a permanent merch store now. I haven't said that on an episode yet. There's a link for that in the description too. There's all kinds of stuff, shirts, jackets, hats, bags, whatever, all kinds of History Fix merch. Perfectly too late for Christmas, but that's a thing now. So if you want to rep some History Fix gear and support the show that way, the link is down there as well. I don't know, y'all. I'm just feeling so inspired. I'm inspired by the Wright brothers. I'm inspired by Robert L. May, and I hope you are too. I want you to know, going into 2025, that you can do big things, no matter how small you feel, no matter how inferior. Maybe you aren't where you want to be right now. Maybe you want to be a famous author and instead you're writing catalog ads. That's okay. That's part of your journey. If Robert May wasn't writing ads for Montgomery Ward in 1939, he never would have had the opportunity to write Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. He never could have known that. Then, though, he never could have known that department store copywriting was just a stop on the way to where he wanted to be. He couldn't see that through the fog. Do not underrate yourself. You may be scrawny and little and weird, but despite all that, you have something the world needs, an idea or a skill or a passion, and you're probably already on that path. You just don't realize it. You can't see it through the fog. Let your light shine. Don't hold it back. Light up that foggy Christmas Eve. Because once you can see where you're going, you'll realize, like Wilbur and Orville and Robert and me, that it's all been part of your journey. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from Time Magazine, NPR, the Chicago Tribune, American Business History Center, On Location Tours, Wikipedia, and Hollywood Reporter. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.